On the morning of April 22nd, 1724, in the Prussian city of Königsberg, a child was born into the household of Johann Georg Kant, a master harness maker whose workshop stood in the Saddler's Quarter near the Pregel River. The infant, christened Immanuel, but later to spell his name Immanuel, entered a world defined by rigid social hierarchies, religious orthodoxy, and the strict commercial regulations of guild manufacture. Königsberg itself, a city of approximately 50,000 inhabitants, served as the capital of East Prussia and maintained its position as a significant Baltic trading port, its economy sustained by grain exports, amber trade, and the skilled labor of artisans who had organized themselves into tightly controlled professional associations for generations. The Kant household occupied modest quarters in a neighborhood where the sounds of hammer and awl marked the rhythms of daily life. Johann Georg Kant had achieved the status of master craftsman through years of apprenticeship and journeyman work, a position that placed the family within the respectable tradesman class, but well below the merchant elite and the administrative nobility who governed the city's affairs. The elder Kant's workshop produced horse harnesses, saddles, and leather goods according to specifications that had changed little over the preceding century, and his reputation depended upon the consistent quality of materials and workmanship that guild inspectors examined with exacting standards. Anna Regina Kant, the child's mother, came from a family of Scottish descent that had settled in the region during earlier migrations of craftsmen and traders. Her own father had worked as a harness maker, and the marriage between Anna Regina Reuter and Johann Georg Kant represented a typical alliance between families of similar trade and social standing. The household she maintained reflected the values of Prussian pietism, a Lutheran reform movement that emphasized personal devotion, moral discipline, and an inward spiritual life characterized by regular prayer, biblical study, and careful self-examination. The pietist influence in Königsberg had grown substantially during the early decades of the 18th century, particularly through the work of Franz Albert Schultz, a theologian who served as professor at the local university and who had established connections with the pietist centers in Halle. Schultz advocated for an education that combined classical learning with religious instruction, rejecting what he viewed as the empty formalism of Orthodox Lutheranism in favor of a Christianity rooted in personal conversion and practical morality. The Kant household embraced these teachings, and Anna Regina in particular devoted herself to raising her children according to pietist principles, insisting upon truthfulness, industry, and a consciousness of divine providence in all earthly affairs. The social landscape of mid-18th century Prussia presented clear boundaries between different orders of society. The nobility held extensive estates in the countryside and staffed the higher offices of state administration and military command. The university professors and higher clergy occupied positions of intellectual authority. The merchant class controlled long-distance trade and accumulated capital through commerce. Below them stood the master craftsmen, organized into guilds that regulated production, set prices, controlled entry into trades, and maintained the distinction between those who possessed civic rights through guild membership and those who did not. At the bottom of the social order labored the journeymen, apprentices, day workers, and servants whose legal status provided them with minimal protection. The Prussian state itself had developed particular characteristics under the rule of Frederick William I, who governed from 1713 until 1740. The king devoted himself to military expansion, bureaucratic efficiency, and fiscal discipline, creating an administrative apparatus that penetrated deeply into provincial life. The state demanded tax revenues, military recruits, and obedience to regulations that governed everything from dress codes to religious observance. Frederick William I mistrusted universities and philosophers, preferring practical knowledge and useful labor to abstract speculation. His court maintained an atmosphere of severe economy and military discipline, and his officials enforced laws with systematic thoroughness. Religious life in Prussia remained largely Lutheran, though denominational differences created ongoing tensions between Orthodox, Pietist, and rationalist factions within the established church. The Orthodoxy insisted upon correct doctrine and traditional forms of worship. The Pietists emphasized personal religious experience and moral reform. The emerging rationalist movement, influenced by natural philosophy and mathematics, began to suggest that religious truth might be demonstrated through reason rather than revelation alone. These divisions played out in university faculties, church appointments, and disputes over the content of religious education. Intellectual culture in German-speaking lands during this period remained dominated by Latin instruction, Aristotelian logic, and the systematic treatises of Lutheran and Reformed theology. The universities at Leipzig, Halle, and other centers maintained curricula based on medieval scholastic methods, though newer currents of thought had begun to circulate through translations of French and English philosophical works. Christian Wolff, a German philosopher who taught at Halle, had developed an elaborate systematic philosophy based on mathematical demonstration, and his textbooks on logic, metaphysics, and ethics provided the standard instruction for students of philosophy across Protestant Germany. The publishing world operated under strict censorship, with both religious and political authorities exercising control over printed materials. Books required approval from university faculties or church consistories before publication, and works deemed heretical or politically dangerous faced prohibition. Most scholarly publication occurred in Latin, which limited readership to those who had received classical education. German-language publication served primarily practical purposes such as devotional literature, legal handbooks, and technical manuals. Scientific investigation had begun to establish new methods and new standards of evidence during the preceding century, though the older natural philosophy based on Aristotelian categories retained strong influence. Isaac Newton's mathematical treatment of motion and gravitation had become known through Latin translations, though many German academics viewed his experimental approach with suspicion. Medical knowledge remained largely Galenic, based on the theory of humors and the practice of bloodletting. Astronomy combined Copernican heliocentrism with elaborate mathematical calculations, while chemistry had not yet separated itself fully from alchemical traditions. The daily rhythms of life in Königsberg followed patterns established by guild regulations, church bells, and seasonal variations. Work began at dawn and continued until evening, with breaks for meals taken according to customary schedules. Sunday observance required attendance at lengthy worship services, during which congregations listened to sermons that often lasted 2 hours or more. The civic calendar marked religious festivals, royal celebrations, and market days. Entertainment consisted primarily of family gatherings, church socials, and occasional public festivities organized for royal occasions. Into this world of ordered hierarchies, religious discipline, and established routines came the child who would spend nearly his entire life within the boundaries of his native city. The circumstances of his birth placed him within a specific social position, neither elevated nor desperately poor, and the religious atmosphere of his household would shape his early formation in ways that persisted long after he had moved away from pietist theological commitments. The institutional structures that governed Königsberg in 1724 assumed a stability that would, in time, face challenges from new ways of thinking about human knowledge, moral obligation, and the proper organization of society. The Kant household included 11 children, though only 5 survived past early childhood. Immanuel was the 4th child and the eldest surviving son. His siblings included an older sister, Regina Dorothea, and younger siblings who would pursue various trades and occupations within the social world, defined by their father's position as a master craftsman. The quarters in which the family lived combined residential space with the workshop where Johann Georg Kant conducted his trade, a common arrangement among urban artisans that meant the children grew up surrounded by the materials and tools of leatherworking. Anna Regina Kant maintained religious discipline within the household through regular family devotions, instruction in biblical passages, and careful supervision of the children's moral development. She insisted upon strict truthfulness, a prohibition against all forms of deception that remained a lifelong principle for her eldest son. The household economy required contributions from all members, and children learned early to assist with various tasks according to their abilities. The mother's health, however, proved fragile, and she suffered from various ailments that periodically confined her to bed. The education available to children of the artisan class in Königsberg consisted primarily of basic reading, writing, and arithmetic instruction provided through church-sponsored schools. The Pietist movement had established particular interest in education as a means of spiritual and moral formation, and Franz Albert Schultz, having observed the Kant family's religious devotion, took notice of the young Immanuel. Schultz recommended that the boy be enrolled in the Collegium Fridericianum, a Pietist secondary school that he directed and that offered classical education to students whose families could not otherwise afford such instruction. In 1732, at the age of 8, Immanuel Kant entered the Collegium Fridericianum as a charity student. The school occupied a substantial building and followed a rigorous daily schedule that began before dawn with prayers and extended through multiple hours of instruction in Latin, Greek, theology, and mathematics. Students rose at 5 in the morning during summer months and even earlier in winter, attending chapel services before beginning their lessons. The curriculum emphasized Latin grammar and composition, requiring students to master the language through constant drill and recitation. The atmosphere at the Collegium Fridericianum reflected the Pietist emphasis on religious discipline and moral supervision. Teachers monitored students for signs of spiritual awakening and moral failing alike, conducting regular examinations of conscience and requiring written accounts of inner spiritual states. Religious instruction occupied several hours each day, with students studying biblical texts, memorizing catechism answers, and listening to sermons that warned against the dangers of worldly pride and carnal temptation. The Pietist teaching treated religion as a matter of personal conversion and heartfelt devotion rather than mere intellectual assent to doctrinal propositions. Despite the school's religious character, the curriculum also included substantial instruction in classical literature and ancient languages. Students read Latin authors including Cicero, Virgil, and Terence, translating passages and imitating classical prose styles. Greek instruction focused primarily on the New Testament, though students also encountered selections from Homer and other ancient writers. The methods of instruction relied heavily on memorization, repetition, and competitive recitation, with teachers maintaining strict discipline through verbal correction and occasional physical punishment. The young Kant demonstrated considerable aptitude for Latin composition and classical literature, though the intensive religious atmosphere of the school apparently produced in him a lasting aversion to certain forms of devotional practice. The constant requirement to examine one's spiritual state, the long hours of prayer and religious instruction, and the emphasis on emotional religious experience created what would later appear as a preference for religion understood through moral duty rather than feeling. The scheduled nature of every activity, the bells that marked transitions between different parts of the day, and the rigid enforcement of rules established patterns of regularity that characterized his later personal habits. Life at the Collegium Fridericianum proceeded according to detailed regulations that governed every aspect of student behavior. Students wore prescribed clothing, ate meals at set times, and followed rules that prohibited various forms of recreation and social interaction. Friendships between students were monitored for potential moral dangers, and any behavior that suggested pride, vanity, or worldly ambition drew correction from faculty. The school sought to produce not merely educated youth, but morally reformed individuals whose outward conduct reflected inner spiritual transformation. The faculty included masters of theology who had studied at Halle and who maintained correspondence with other pietist institutions. They assigned students to read devotional works by pietist authors, requiring written summaries and reflections on these texts. The teaching emphasized practical Christianity expressed through acts of charity, honesty in all dealings, and submission to divine providence. Students learned that true religion consisted not in external observances, but in the sincere intention of the heart, and that God examined motives rather than mere actions. Academic instruction followed scholastic methods inherited from medieval universities, with students learning logic through the categories and prior analytics of Aristotle. They studied natural philosophy through textbooks that presented Aristotelian physics, and they learned metaphysics through Christian Wolff's systematic presentations of rational theology and ontology. Mathematics instruction covered elementary arithmetic, geometry, and basic algebra, though the emphasis remained on literary and linguistic education rather than mathematical science. The daily schedule left little time for activities outside prescribed duties. Students attended morning prayers, Latin instruction, religious study, Greek translation, mathematics, and evening devotions according to a timetable that changed only with the seasons. Meals consisted of simple fare served at long tables, and students observed silence during meals while listening to religious readings. Recreation periods were brief and supervised, with students forbidden to wander in the city or engage in games that might lead to disorder. During these years at the Collegium Fridericianum, the boy's mother continued to suffer from declining health. Anna Regina Kant died in 1737 when her son was 13 years old. The loss removed the principal source of religious influence in the household, though the pietist formation he had received both at home and at school had already established certain habits of thought and certain moral commitments that would persist in altered form throughout his life. Johann Georg Kant continued to operate his workshop and to provide for his remaining children, though the father appears to have had limited education and little interest in intellectual pursuits beyond the practical knowledge required for his trade. The distance between the world of the artisan workshop and the world of classical learning represented a divide that the son would cross definitively, though certain values associated with honest labor and moral uprightness remained. The young Kant continued his studies at the Collegium Fridericianum until 1740, completing 8 years of instruction in classical languages, mathematics, and theology. The school prepared students primarily for university study in theology, and the expectation held by teachers and by Franz Albert Schultz was that the promising young scholar would proceed to theological education at the University of Königsberg and eventually enter the Lutheran ministry. The path from pietist secondary education to theological studies to clerical positions represented a recognized trajectory for talented students from modest backgrounds. In the autumn of 1740, Immanuel Kant, having now adopted the Latinized spelling of his given name, enrolled as a student at the University of Königsberg. The university itself had been founded in 1544 by Duke Albert of Prussia and maintained faculties of theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. The Faculty of Philosophy served as a preparatory division where students studied logic, metaphysics, mathematics, and natural philosophy before proceeding to advanced study in one of the higher faculties. The institution's size was modest, with perhaps a few dozen professors and several hundred students at any given time. The university building stood in the center of the city, and instruction took place in lecture halls where professors read from prepared texts, while students took notes. The academic year followed a schedule determined by religious festivals and seasonal considerations, with lecture courses extending over several months. Students paid fees directly to professors for attending lectures, and financial considerations meant that poorer students often attended only selected courses rather than the full curriculum. Kant entered the university as a student in the Faculty of Philosophy, though his precise course of study during the initial years remains unclear from surviving records. University instruction at Königsberg followed the pattern established at other German universities, with professors lecturing on prescribed textbooks in logic, metaphysics, natural theology, and moral philosophy. The dominant philosophical influence remained Christian Wolff's systematic philosophy, which presented all knowledge as deducible from clear definitions and logical demonstrations according to mathematical method. During his university years, Kant encountered Martin Knutzen, a young professor of logic and metaphysics who had studied the new physics of Isaac Newton and who introduced mathematical and scientific subjects alongside traditional philosophical instruction. Knutzen represented a generation of German academics who sought to reconcile Wolffian systematic philosophy with Newtonian natural science, and his teaching apparently made a significant impression on the young student. Knutzen lectured on Newton's Principia Mathematica and on the implications of the new astronomy for understanding the physical cosmos. The student's financial situation remained precarious throughout his university years. Unlike students from wealthy families who could afford rooms, servants, and regular meal plans, Kant survived on minimal resources, taking meals irregularly and lodging in cheap quarters. The tradition of student table companions, where poorer students provided conversation and intellectual companionship to wealthy families in exchange for meals, offered one means of subsistence. Records suggest that Kant served in such capacity for various Königsberg families during different periods. The university also presented opportunities for hearing lectures on mathematics, natural history, and geography, subjects that attracted the students' interest alongside purely philosophical topics. Geography, in particular, understood as the systematic description of the Earth's surface, peoples, and customs, offered a field that combined empirical observation with systematic classification. Natural history involved the collection and categorization of minerals, plants, and animals according to observable characteristics, and the subject had begun to develop more rigorous taxonomic methods. The death of Frederick William I in 1740 and the accession of Frederick II, later called Frederick the Great, marked a shift in Prussian political and cultural atmosphere. The new king, educated in French philosophy and interested in arts and sciences, relaxed some of the austere military discipline that had characterized his father's reign. Frederick II corresponded with Voltaire and other French intellectuals, and under his rule, Berlin began to develop cultural institutions that promoted scientific academies and philosophical discussion. However, these changes in the capital affected the provinces slowly, and Königsberg maintained much of its traditional character. During his time at university, Kant began to read more widely in contemporary philosophy and science. He encountered the writings of English empiricist philosophers through German translations, though detailed knowledge of these works would come later. He studied Newton's physics and astronomy in Latin editions, working through the mathematical demonstrations of gravitational attraction and planetary motion. He read Wolff's extensive systematic works on logic, metaphysics, practical philosophy, and natural theology, absorbing the method of demonstration from definitions, even as he would later criticize many of Wolff's specific doctrines. The lecture system at German universities meant that students heard the same material presented repeatedly with minor variations as professors worked through standard textbooks, paragraph by paragraph. This method aimed to ensure that students mastered established knowledge before attempting any original contributions to learning. Professors themselves held positions that required them to defend orthodox positions in theology and to avoid innovations that might draw accusations of heterodoxy or atheism. Financial pressures forced Kant to interrupt his formal studies before completing a degree. In 1746 or 1747, he left the university and took employment as a private tutor in households outside Königsberg. This represented a common occupation for educated young men without independent means, and tutorial positions provided income while allowing time for continued study and writing. The records of this period remain sparse, but evidence suggests that Kant served as tutor in several different households in the East Prussian countryside over approximately 9 years. The work of a private tutor involved instructing children of noble or wealthy families in classical languages, mathematics, geography, and other subjects deemed appropriate for their education. Tutors lived in the household, taking meals with the family, and following the household schedule. The position provided room and board along with modest salary, and it placed educated men of common birth in daily contact with families of higher social standing, creating situations that required careful navigation of social proprieties and appropriate deference. During these years working as a private tutor, Kant continued his studies independently, reading philosophical and scientific works, and beginning to formulate his own ideas on various topics. The distance from university life and the relative isolation of country estates meant that intellectual development proceeded without regular conversation with other scholars, though correspondence and occasional visits to Königsberg allowed some contact with university circles. The tutorial positions brought Kant into different households with varying atmospheres and expectations. One position placed him with the family of a Reformed church pastor, providing exposure to a different theological tradition from the Lutheranism in which he had been raised. Another position involved tutoring in the household of a landed nobleman, where he observed the manners and social practices of the aristocracy. These experiences provided practical knowledge of social differences and the ways in which education functioned to prepare children for specific social roles. The private study undertaken during these years included continued work in mathematics and natural philosophy. Kant read treatises on mechanics, astronomy, and physical geography, developing particular interest in cosmological questions about the formation and structure of the universe. He studied recent scientific literature on topics ranging from the nature of fire to theories about the Earth's rotation and the causes of earthquakes and winds. This engagement with natural science, pursued outside the formal university curriculum, would inform his first published writings. In 1749, while still working as a tutor, Kant published his first work, a short treatise titled Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces. The work addressed a technical dispute in physics concerning the correct measure of force in moving bodies, a question that had divided continental and British natural philosophers. René Descartes had argued that the quantity of motion should be measured by mass times velocity, while Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz had proposed that living force should be measured by mass times the square of velocity. The young author attempted to mediate this dispute by suggesting that both measures were correct in their respective domains. The treatise demonstrated familiarity with recent scientific literature and showed the author's ability to engage with technical problems in natural philosophy. However, the work made little impact on contemporary debates, and it appears that Kant himself later recognized that his proposed solution to the living forces problem was inadequate. The significance of this first publication lay not in any lasting contribution to physics, but in the fact that it marked the beginning of a career devoted to examining fundamental questions about knowledge, nature, and the proper methods of philosophical and scientific investigation. The years as a private tutor extended until 1755, a period during which the aspiring philosopher matured intellectually while remaining outside the institutional structures of academic life. The isolation of these years meant that there was no regular intellectual community with which to test ideas, no established mentor to guide research, and no access to university libraries and their collections of books and journals. Whatever reading Kant pursued had to be obtained through private purchase, borrowing from the households where he worked, or occasional trips to Königsberg to visit booksellers. During the summer of 1755, having returned to Königsberg, Kant prepared to resume his formal connection with the university. The path to an academic career in German universities required first the completion of a magister degree, which involved defending a thesis in a public disputation, and then the completion of a second dissertation that qualified the candidate to offer private lectures. These lectures, given by unsalaried private docents, charged fees to students who chose to attend, and the income from such lectures provided the only compensation for junior faculty until they obtained salaried professorships. In April 1755, Kant submitted his magister thesis, a work in Latin titled A New Elucidation of the First Principles of Metaphysical Cognition. The thesis examined fundamental logical principles and proposed revisions to traditional formulations of the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of contradiction. The work showed engagement with Leibnizian philosophy and demonstrated the candidate's ability to handle technical problems in logic and metaphysics. The public defense of the thesis took place according to university regulations, with the candidate responding to objections from designated opponents in a formal disputation. Having obtained the magister degree, Kant immediately began work on the second dissertation, required for the habilitation that would grant him the right to lecture. This second work, titled Physical Monadology, addressed the relationship between the physical and metaphysical constitution of matter. The dissertation attempted to reconcile the infinite divisibility of space with the existence of simple, indivisible substances that serve as the ultimate constituents of material reality. The work drew on both Newtonian physics and Leibnizian metaphysics, seeking a synthesis that would preserve what Kant viewed as valid in each system. The physical monadology was defended in September 1755, and with the successful completion of this second dissertation, Kant gained the status of private docent at the University of Königsberg. This position meant that he could now announce lectures and receive fees from students who attended, though it provided no salary and no security of employment. The private docent remained dependent on attracting sufficient students to generate adequate income, and the position could be maintained only so long as the lecturer could continue to draw audiences. In the autumn of 1755, at the age of 31, Kant began his career as a university lecturer. The topics he offered to teach included logic, metaphysics, natural theology, mathematics, physical geography, and anthropology. University regulations required that lectures follow prescribed textbooks, which the lecturer would explain paragraph by paragraph to students. The choice of textbooks required approval from the faculty, and lecturers generally selected widely used works by established authorities rather than attempting to present entirely original systems of thought. For his logic lectures, Kant used Georg Friedrich Mayer's Auszug aus der Vernunftlehre, a compendium of Wolffian logical doctrine. For metaphysics, he lectured on Alexander Baumgarten's Metaphysica, a Latin textbook that systematically presented rational psychology, cosmology, and natural theology according to the demonstrative method favored by Wolffian philosophy. For ethics, he used Baumgarten's Initia Philosophiae Practicae, and for anthropology, he drew on various sources while developing his own approach to the systematic study of human nature. The daily routine of a private docent involved preparing lectures, meeting students, and pursuing independent research and writing. Kant established a practice of lecturing in the morning and early afternoon hours, with different courses scheduled on different days of the week. The lectures took place in rented rooms or in halls provided by the university, and students paid fees at the beginning of each course. The number of students attending varied depending on the subject, and the lecturer's reputation and income fluctuated accordingly. Living arrangements for the privet docent remained modest, with Kant renting rooms in various houses in Königsberg over the subsequent years. The rooms provided space for sleeping, study, and the storage of books, but the lecturer took meals at taverns or through arrangements with landlords who provided board along with lodging. The schedule of meals, walks, and work began to assume a regularity that would become increasingly pronounced over the decades. The private docent years required constant effort to maintain enrollment, while also pursuing research and publication that might enhance reputation and increase the likelihood of obtaining a salaried professorship. Kant continued to write on topics in natural philosophy and metaphysics, publishing a series of short works and essays during the late 1750s. These writings addressed subjects ranging from the theory of winds to the causes of earthquakes, from the aging of the Earth to the question of whether the rotation of the Earth on its axis had slowed over time. In 1755, Kant also published his Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, a more ambitious work that proposed a mechanical explanation for the formation of the solar system and the larger universe. The work suggested that the cosmos had developed from an initial state of dispersed matter through the action of gravitational attraction and repulsive forces, with stars, planetary systems, and galaxies forming through natural processes operating according to Newtonian laws. The theory anticipated later nebular hypotheses about stellar and planetary formation, though Kant's version combined mechanical explanation with theological assumptions about divine creation of the initial matter and laws. The Universal Natural History presented a vision of the physical universe as a dynamic system governed by mathematical laws, with order emerging from matter in motion according to necessary causal principles. The work showed Kant's engagement with astronomy and his ability to think systematically about cosmological questions, though it made little immediate impact on scientific debates and remained largely unknown to contemporaries due to the bankruptcy of the publisher shortly after the book appeared. Teaching at the university required several lectures each week during the academic terms, which ran from autumn through spring, with breaks for major religious festivals. The lecturer stood at a podium and read through the prescribed textbook, adding explanations, examples, and critical observations. Students took notes on the commentary, which provided elaboration and sometimes correction of the textbook's doctrines. The method assumed that students would learn both the standard positions and the lecturer's own modifications of those positions. The topics covered in lectures reflected the traditional division of philosophy into logic, metaphysics, and ethics, along with newer subjects like anthropology and physical geography. Logic instruction focused on formal rules of inference, the division of concepts, and the structure of scientific demonstration. Metaphysics treated questions about the nature of reality, including the existence and properties of God, the immortality of the soul, and the fundamental characteristics of substances, forces, and causal relations. Ethics addressed the foundations of moral obligation, the nature of virtue, and the relationship between happiness and duty. Physical geography, a subject Kant taught regularly throughout his career, involved systematic description of the Earth's surface features, climate zones, natural resources, and human populations. The lectures drew on travel literature, scientific reports, and compilations of geographical information to present a comprehensive view of the planet's physical and human diversity. Anthropology lectures examined human nature from various perspectives, including physical characteristics, psychological capacities, moral tendencies, and cultural variations. The private docent years proceeded without dramatic events or sudden changes in circumstances. Kant lectured, studied, wrote, and participated in the social life of Königsberg to a moderate degree. He attended occasional gatherings of professors and educated citizens, maintaining friendships with several colleagues and acquaintances. The routine of lectures, study, and social interaction established patterns that would continue for decades, with variations in emphasis and content but consistent in basic structure. Financial circumstances remained constrained, as income from lecture fees alone provided only modest support. The private docent position offered no pension, no guarantee of future employment, and no security beyond what the lecturer could earn each term from student fees. This economic uncertainty made the pursuit of a salaried professorship a practical necessity rather than merely an ambition, and Kant applied for various academic positions as they became available. In 1758, a professorship in logic and metaphysics became vacant at the University of Königsberg. Kant applied for the position, submitting the required testimonials and documentation of his publications and teaching experience. However, the position was awarded to another candidate, and Kant continued as private docent. Similar disappointments followed with other positions over the subsequent years, as academic appointments depended not only on scholarly merit, but also on patronage, political connections, and factors beyond the candidate's control. During the 7 Years' War, which involved Prussia in conflict with Austria, Russia, and other powers from 1756 to 1763, Königsberg experienced Russian occupation from 1758 to 1762. The city swore allegiance to the Russian Empress, and Russian military administration governed the territory during these years. The occupation brought changes to daily life, but did not fundamentally disrupt the university's operations, and lectures continued according to normal schedules. Kant lived through this period without apparent difficulty, and the presence of Russian officers in the city even provided new social contacts and opportunities for conversation with educated men from different backgrounds. The lecturer's publications during the late 1750s and early 1760s included essays on various topics submitted to the Berlin Academy's prize competitions and articles published in Königsberg newspapers and journals. These occasional writings addressed questions about optimism and theodicy, about the demonstrability of God's existence, about the concept of negative magnitudes in philosophy, and about the proper method of metaphysics. The essays showed development in Kant's thinking about fundamental philosophical problems, though they did not yet present the systematic critical philosophy that would emerge in later decades. The daily routine included morning hours devoted to preparing lectures and to reading, afternoon lectures at the university, and evening social activities or continued study. Kant walked regularly through the streets of Königsberg, following routes that became familiar to neighbors and acquaintances. The walks served both as exercise and as time for thinking through problems, and the regularity of these walks would later become proverbial among those who knew him. Meals provided occasion for social interaction as well as nourishment. Kant frequently dined in company, either at taverns or as a guest in the homes of friends and colleagues. The conversations at table ranged over various subjects, including university affairs, political news, scientific developments, and philosophical questions. Kant apparently enjoyed these social interactions and contributed actively to conversation, displaying knowledge of diverse subjects and a capacity for engaging discussion that contrasted with the abstract and technical character of his published writings. The lecturer's study contained a growing collection of books acquired through purchase and gifts from publishers. The collection included philosophical works in Latin and German, scientific treatises, travel accounts, historical works, and literary productions. Kant read widely beyond the immediate requirements of his lectures, maintaining engagement with intellectual developments across multiple fields. Reading occupied evening hours and days when no lectures were scheduled, and the habit of systematic reading supported both teaching and research. As the 1760s progressed, Kant's reputation as a lecturer grew, and enrollment in his courses increased. Students appreciated the clarity of his explanations and the breadth of knowledge he displayed across different subjects. The lectures on physical geography attracted particularly large audiences, as the subject combined scientific information with entertaining descriptions of exotic lands and peoples. The metaphysics lectures drew smaller but dedicated groups of students interested in fundamental philosophical problems. In 1762, Kant published a short work titled The False Subtlety of the Four Syllogistic Figures, which argued that traditional logic's distinction between four figures of syllogism rested on arbitrary and unnecessary complexity. The work showed Kant's continuing interest in logical questions and his willingness to criticize received doctrines when he judged them confused or needlessly intricate. The essay exemplified an approach that valued clarity and simplicity over elaborate systems that multiplied distinctions without genuine insight. The same year saw publication of another short work, The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God. This essay examined the traditional arguments for God's existence and proposed that only one line of reasoning, based on the concept of necessary existence, could provide genuine demonstration of divine reality. The work engaged with debates in natural theology and showed Kant's careful analysis of the logical structure of theological arguments, though he would later revise his position on whether any theoretical demonstration of God's existence was possible. The continued effort to secure a salaried professorship led Kant to apply for positions outside Königsberg when opportunities arose. In 1764, he applied for a chair of poetry at the university, a position that might have led him away from philosophy into literary and aesthetic studies. However, that position went to another candidate. Later that same year, a professorship of mathematics became available at Königsberg, and Kant considered applying, though he ultimately decided against pursuing that position. The mathematical professorship eventually went to another scholar, while Kant remained in the privat docent position teaching philosophy. The publication in 1764 of observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime marked a departure from the more technical philosophical essays of previous years. This work examined aesthetic and moral sentiments, discussing different forms of beauty and different temperaments in human character. The essay drew on contemporary literature about aesthetic feeling and moral sense, presenting observations in a more essayistic style than the demonstrative method of Kant's metaphysical writings. The work showed engagement with questions about taste, moral psychology, and the sources of human motivation. Also, in 1764, Kant published an inquiry concerning the distinctness of the principles of natural theology and morality, an essay written for a Berlin Academy Prize competition. The essay argued that mathematics achieves certainty through constructing its concepts in intuition, while philosophy must analyze concepts already given in ordinary understanding. The work suggested that metaphysics should abandon the pretense of mathematical demonstration and instead pursue careful conceptual analysis that examines the presuppositions of our knowledge. This essay indicated movement toward the critical method that would later characterize Kant's mature philosophy. Teaching loads during these years remained substantial, with Kant regularly offering multiple lecture courses each term. The preparation required for these lectures, combined with the actual hours spent lecturing, left limited time for sustained research and writing. Yet the lecturer continued to produce essays and shorter works, while also beginning to formulate more comprehensive philosophical projects that would require years to complete. The social life of Königsberg provided occasions for conversation and leisure activities that Kant apparently enjoyed. He played cards with friends, attended concerts and theatrical performances, and participated in dinner parties where educated men gathered to discuss current topics. These social activities provided relief from the demands of teaching and study, and they allowed Kant to maintain friendships and to engage with people outside the narrow circle of university faculty. The economic situation of the private docent improved gradually as student enrollment increased and as Kant's reputation grew. However, the income remained uncertain and dependent on semester-to-semester enrollment figures. A salaried professorship would provide security and regular income independent of fluctuating student numbers, and the continued inability to obtain such a position represented both a practical frustration and a professional disappointment. In 1766, Kant received appointment as under-librarian at the Royal Library in Königsberg, a position that provided a small salary and access to the library's collections. The work involved cataloging books, assisting readers, and maintaining the library's organization, and the position required only a few hours of attendance each week. The additional income and the access to books made the position valuable despite the modest compensation it provided. The same year saw publication of Dreams of a Spirit Seer elucidated by Dreams of Metaphysics, a peculiar work in which Kant examined the claims of Immanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish mystic who reported visions of the spirit world and communications with the dead. Kant treated Swedenborg's accounts skeptically, while also using them as occasion to criticize metaphysical speculation that claimed knowledge of realities beyond possible experience. The work showed Kant's growing doubt about the possibility of metaphysics understood as a theoretical science of supersensible reality, though he had not yet developed the positive alternative that his critical philosophy would provide. The lectures continued through the late 1760s, with Kant teaching the standard subjects according to the prescribed textbooks, while increasingly departing from those textbooks in his actual presentations. Students noted that the lecturer often criticized the very texts he was ostensibly explaining, pointing out confusions in the author's reasoning or questioning the adequacy of their arguments. This critical approach to received doctrine reflected the development of Kant's own philosophical positions, though he had not yet published comprehensive statements of those positions. In 1769, the universities of Erlangen and Jena both offered professorships to Kant, providing opportunities to leave Königsberg for positions at more prestigious institutions in other German territories. Kant declined both offers, choosing to remain in his native city despite the continued uncertainty of his position as private docent. The decision to stay in Königsberg would prove permanent, as Kant never traveled more than a few miles from the city during his entire life. The following year, in 1770, a professorship in logic and metaphysics finally became available at the University of Königsberg. This time, Kant's application succeeded, and he received appointment to the salaried chair that he had sought for more than a decade. The appointment required the traditional inaugural dissertation, and Kant composed a work titled On the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World. The dissertation presented a new theory about the relationship between sensible intuition and intellectual understanding, arguing that space and time are forms of sensible intuition rather than properties of things as they exist independently of human cognition. The public defense of the inaugural dissertation took place in August 1770, with the new professor responding to objections according to academic ceremony. The work marked a turning point in Kant's philosophical development, as it articulated for the first time the distinction between appearances and things in themselves that would become central to his critical philosophy. However, the dissertation presented only part of what would become the full critical system, and Kant recognized that much work remained to develop a complete account of human knowledge and its limits. The professorship provided a salary of approximately 400 thalers per year, a modest but stable income that removed the economic uncertainty of the private docent position. The professor now had security of employment, a regular income independent of student enrollment, and the social status that came with holding an established chair at the university. The appointment at age 46 came relatively late in comparison to some academic careers, but it secured Kant's position and allowed him to pursue philosophical research with greater freedom from immediate financial pressures. The lecture schedule continued much as before, though as a full professor, Kant could teach somewhat fewer courses than he had offered as private docent. The obligation to use prescribed textbooks remained, and Kant continued to lecture on Baumgarten's Metaphysica and Mayer's Logic, though his commentary departed increasingly from these authors' positions. Students attended these lectures and heard the professor criticize and revise the very doctrines presented in the official textbooks, creating a situation where formal compliance with university regulations coexisted with substantive independence of thought. The years immediately following the 1770 appointment saw Kant working intensively on the development of his critical philosophy. He lectured, fulfilled his administrative duties as a professor, and devoted available time to thinking through the fundamental problems that the inaugural dissertation had raised, but not resolved. The work proceeded slowly, with Kant repeatedly revising his plans and delaying publication as he grappled with difficult questions about the nature of human understanding and the scope of possible knowledge. Correspondence from this period shows Kant discussing philosophical problems with Marcus Hertz, a former student, and with other scholars who had read the inaugural dissertation. These letters reveal Kant's awareness that significant problems remained to be solved before he could present a complete critical philosophy. The question of how pure concepts of the understanding relate to objects of experience required extended analysis, and Kant spent years developing his answer to this question. The daily routine settled into patterns that remained largely unchanged for decades. The professor rose at the same hour each morning, spent time in study before giving lectures, took a midday meal with friends or colleagues, walked through the city at a regular time in the afternoon, and returned to study in the evening. This regularity provided structure that supported sustained intellectual work, and it became so consistent that, according to later accounts, neighbors could set their watches by Kant's daily walk. The philosophical work undertaken during the 1770s involved rethinking fundamental questions about metaphysics, epistemology, and the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge. Kant examined the traditional problems of rational psychology, cosmology, and theology, analyzing the arguments that previous metaphysicians had offered and identifying the logical errors that he believed vitiated those arguments. This critical examination led him to conclude that theoretical metaphysics, as traditionally practiced, could not provide knowledge of supersensible reality, though reason nevertheless generated ideas of God, freedom, and immortality that played essential roles in moral philosophy. The development of the critical philosophy required Kant to work out a complex system of categories, principles, and arguments that would explain both the possibility of mathematical and scientific knowledge and the impossibility of traditional metaphysics. The task proved difficult and time-consuming, and publication of the complete system was repeatedly delayed as Kant refined his positions and extended his analysis to new problems. Friends and correspondents inquired about when the promised work would appear, and Kant offered various estimates of how much longer the completion would require. Years passed with no publication, though the professor continued to lecture and to participate in the social and intellectual life of Königsberg. The work proceeded in private study, with extensive notes and drafts that were revised and reorganized as Kant's thinking developed. In 1781, 11 years after the inaugural dissertation, Kant finally published the Critique of Pure Reason, a substantial work of more than 800 pages that presented his critical philosophy in systematic form. The book appeared with the imprint of a Riga publisher and received limited initial distribution. The work examined the conditions under which human knowledge is possible, arguing that our cognitive faculties impose certain forms and categories on experience that make scientific knowledge possible, while also limiting knowledge to the domain of possible experience. The Critique of Pure Reason presented arguments about the nature of space and time as forms of intuition, about the categories of understanding that structure experience, about the principles that govern empirical knowledge, and about the errors that arise when reason attempts to extend knowledge beyond possible experience. The work criticized traditional proofs for God's existence, arguments for the immortality of the soul, and claims about the ultimate nature of reality. The book concluded that theoretical reason cannot establish the truth of metaphysical doctrines about supersensible reality, though it left open the possibility that practical reason might provide grounds for rational faith in God, freedom, and immortality. The initial reception of the Critique of Pure Reason proved disappointing to the author. The work's difficult style, technical vocabulary, and complex arguments made it challenging to read, and few reviewers seemed to grasp the essential points Kant was making. One early review dismissed the book as presenting a form of idealism similar to Berkeley's philosophy, a characterization that Kant regarded as a fundamental misunderstanding of his position. The lack of comprehension among early readers troubled Kant and led him to compose supplementary works intended to clarify his meaning. In 1783, Kant published Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, a shorter work written in a more accessible style that presented the main arguments of the Critique of Pure Reason in a different form. The Prolegomena began with the fact of scientific knowledge and asked what conditions must obtain for such knowledge to be possible, rather than following the more abstract and systematic approach of the critique. The work helped some readers understand Kant's philosophical project, though the critical philosophy remained controversial and difficult to interpret. The professorship continued to require regular lectures on logic, metaphysics, ethics, and other subjects. Kant now taught his own critical philosophy in these lectures, explaining to students how the new system differed from the Wolffian philosophy presented in the prescribed textbooks. The lectures on metaphysics began with criticism of rational psychology, cosmology, and theology, showing students why traditional metaphysical arguments failed to provide knowledge. The ethics lectures started to develop the moral philosophy that Kant would publish in subsequent works. The mid-1780s saw Kant publishing a series of shorter works and essays that addressed various topics related to the critical philosophy. In 1784, he published an essay titled An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?, which argued that enlightenment consists in humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity through the public use of reason. The essay defended intellectual freedom and criticized restrictions on the publication and discussion of ideas, though it distinguished between the public use of reason in scholarly discourse and the private use of reason in carrying out official duties. Another essay from 1784, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose, presented a philosophy of history that interpreted human development as progress toward the realization of rational capacities and the establishment of just political institutions. The essay suggested that conflict and competition among human beings serve as means by which nature develops humanity's latent capacities, and it proposed that history has a purposive direction toward the establishment of a cosmopolitan civil society. In 1785, Kant published The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, a work that presented his ethical theory in systematic form. The book argued that moral obligation is based on the categorical imperative, a principle that commands unconditionally rather than hypothetically. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in several ways, including the principle that one should act only according to maxims that one could will to be universal laws, and the principle that one should treat humanity always as an end and never merely as a means. The work grounded morality in reason rather than in feeling or in consequences, and it presented duty as the fundamental moral concept. The groundwork proved influential in moral philosophy and generated considerable discussion among Kant's contemporaries. The work's emphasis on duty and its rejection of happiness as the foundation of ethics represented a sharp departure from previous moral theories, and the categorical imperative provided a criterion for moral judgment that appeared both rigorous and demanding. Critics questioned whether Kant's formalism could generate substantive moral guidance and whether duty could motivate action independently of inclination, but the work established Kant as a major figure in ethical theory. The late 1780s brought Kant into intellectual controversies with other German philosophers. Moses Mendelssohn had published arguments defending rational theology and the traditional proofs for God's existence, positions that Kant's critical philosophy rejected. Kant responded to Mendelssohn's arguments while defending his own position that theoretical reason cannot establish metaphysical truths about God, though he maintained that practical reason provides grounds for moral faith in divine existence. Another controversy involved responses to the critique of pure reason from philosophers who interpreted Kant's idealism as a form of skepticism or as a denial of external reality. These criticisms prompted Kant to clarify his position in various writings, insisting that transcendental idealism, which treats space and time as forms of intuition rather than properties of things in themselves, differs fundamentally from empirical idealism or skepticism about the external world. In 1787, Kant published a second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, with extensive revisions to the first part of the work, and with a new preface that responded to critics. The second edition clarified certain arguments and provided additional explanation of difficult passages, though the fundamental positions remained unchanged. The work still presented formidable challenges to readers, and the critical philosophy continued to generate misunderstandings and controversy. The professorship brought administrative responsibilities that increased as Kant's seniority at the university grew. He served periodic terms as dean of the philosophical faculty, a position that required attending meetings, reviewing academic matters, and handling various administrative tasks. These duties took time away from research and writing, though they were not exceptionally burdensome compared to the demands faced by professors at larger institutions. The social life in Königsberg continued to provide regular occasions for conversation and companionship. Kant dined regularly, with friends, maintaining particular friendships with Joseph Green, an English merchant living in Königsberg, and with several other educated men who enjoyed philosophical discussion. The dinners often extended over several hours, with conversation ranging across politics, science, literature, and philosophy. Kant apparently enjoyed these social occasions and participated actively in conversation, though he preferred small gatherings to large public assemblies. The daily walk through the city remained a fixed element of the routine, with Kant following the same route at the same time each afternoon. The walk served both as exercise and as time for reflection, and the regularity of this practice became so well known that it was said that citizens could set their clocks when they saw the professor pass. The route took Kant through familiar streets, past buildings and shops that he had known since childhood, and the walk reinforced his connection to the physical environment of Königsberg. In 1788, Kant published the Critique of Practical Reason, a work that developed his moral philosophy more fully than the groundwork had done. The book examined the foundations of moral obligation, the nature of practical reason, and the relationship between morality and happiness. Kant argued that practical reason, unlike theoretical reason, can establish the reality of freedom as a necessary presupposition of moral agency. The work also addressed the concept of the highest good, which combines virtue and happiness, and suggested that rational faith in God and immortality provides practical grounds for believing that the highest good is possible. The Critique of Practical Reason completed the systematic presentation of Kant's moral philosophy and established him as the leading moral philosopher in German-speaking lands. The work's emphasis on autonomy, duty, and the dignity of rational beings influenced subsequent ethical theory profoundly, and it provided the foundation for moral and political philosophy developed by later thinkers. The same period saw Kant publishing essays on various topics in journals and collections. He wrote about the use of teleological principles in philosophy, about the theory of beauty and art, about religion within the limits of reason alone, and about political topics including the nature of sovereignty and the conditions for perpetual peace among nations. These shorter works showed the range of Kant's interests and the application of his critical method to diverse philosophical problems. In 1790, Kant published the Critique of Judgment, the third and final critique in his systematic philosophy. The work examined aesthetic judgment and teleological judgment, analyzing how we make judgments about beauty and about purposiveness in nature. The book argued that aesthetic judgments claim universal validity despite being based on subjective feeling, and it explained this claim through analysis of the free play of imagination and understanding in aesthetic experience. The teleological part of the work addressed how we use concepts of purpose when studying living organisms, arguing that while we cannot prove that nature is actually purposive, we must think of organisms as if they were designed for the sake of certain ends. The Critique of Judgment completed the critical system and provided connections between theoretical and practical philosophy through the concepts of purposiveness and the relationship between nature and freedom. The work influenced aesthetics and philosophy of biology, and it raised questions about the relationship between mechanism and teleology that continued to occupy philosophers and scientists in subsequent generations. By 1790, Kant had published the Three Critiques and established the fundamental positions of his critical philosophy. He was 66 years old and had been professor at Königsberg for 20 years. His reputation had grown substantially, and students came from various parts of Germany to hear him lecture. His works were discussed widely, and his philosophical positions became central topics in German academic philosophy. The 1790s brought new controversies and new publications. Kant continued to lecture regularly despite advancing age, and he maintained the daily routines that had structured his life for decades. The routine of rising early, preparing lectures, teaching, dining with friends, taking the afternoon walk, and studying in the evening proceeded with little variation. The regularity provided stability and allowed sustained intellectual work despite the physical changes that came with aging. In 1793, Kant published Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, a work that examined the relationship between religion and morality. The book argued that true religion consists in moral duty rather than in ritual observances or metaphysical doctrines about divine nature. Kant presented a rational reconstruction of Christian doctrines, interpreting them as symbolic expressions of moral truths rather than as historical claims requiring faith. The work generated controversy with religious authorities, and Prussian censors objected to Kant's treatment of revelation and ecclesiastical authority. The Prussian government, under Frederick William II, had become less tolerant of religious heterodoxy than it had been under Frederick II. The new king supported conservative religious policies, and ministers sought to enforce Orthodox Lutheran teaching in universities and publications. Kant's Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason appeared to challenge traditional Christian doctrines, and authorities viewed it as potentially dangerous to religious faith and public morals. In 1794, the Prussian government issued an order prohibiting Kant from publishing or lecturing on religious topics. The order came through Johann Christoph Wöllner, the minister responsible for religious affairs, and it warned Kant that continued publication on religion would result in unpleasant consequences. The prohibition represented a significant restriction on Kant's intellectual freedom and required him to promise that he would refrain from further public statements on religious matters. Kant complied with the order while interpreting it narrowly. He ceased publishing on religious topics, but continued to lecture on subjects related to ethics and philosophy more generally. He understood the prohibition to bind him only during the current king's reign, and he maintained private convictions about the proper relationship between religion and morality, despite the governmental restriction on their public expression. The censorship episode troubled Kant, as it represented exactly the kind of restriction on the public use of reason that his essay on enlightenment had criticized. However, direct defiance of governmental authority would have risked serious professional and personal consequences, and Kant chose compliance while maintaining his intellectual independence in private. The restriction remained in force until Frederick William II's death in 1797, after which Kant considered himself released from the promise. During the mid-1790s, Kant published works on political philosophy and international relations. In 1795, he published Toward Perpetual Peace, an essay that proposed conditions for ending war and establishing lasting peace among nations. The work advocated for republican government, the federation of free states, and the development of cosmopolitan right that would protect individuals regardless of their national citizenship. The essay influenced later thinking about international law and the possibility of supranational institutions to maintain peace. In 1797, Kant published The Metaphysics of Morals, a comprehensive work that presented his political and legal philosophy alongside his ethical theory. The book addressed questions about the foundations of right, the nature of property, the legitimacy of political authority, and the principles of criminal punishment. The work provided systematic treatment of topics that Kant had previously addressed only in essays or lectures, and it completed his moral and political philosophy. The lectures continued through the late 1790s despite Kant's advancing age and declining health. Students reported that the professor's memory had begun to fail and that he sometimes lost his train of thought during lectures. The once clear and systematic presentations became more difficult to follow, and Kant struggled to maintain the coherence that had characterized his earlier teaching. The physical act of standing for long periods while lecturing became more difficult, and Kant's energy diminished. Friends noticed changes in Kant's mental state as well. He became more repetitive in conversation, returning to the same topics and telling the same stories multiple times. His memory for recent events deteriorated while his recollection of earlier periods remained relatively intact. The systematic organization of thought that had distinguished his philosophical work became harder to maintain in everyday activities, and Kant needed assistance with matters that he had previously handled independently. In 1796, Kant gave his final lecture at the university. The decision to stop teaching came from recognition that he could no longer fulfill the duties of a professor adequately. The retirement from active teaching did not immediately end Kant's connection with the university, as he retained his professorial status and continued to receive his salary. However, the daily routine that had included morning preparation and afternoon lectures now changed, and Kant spent more time at home with fewer regular obligations. The years after 1796 saw continued decline in Kant's physical and mental capacities. He worked on various manuscripts, attempting to complete a systematic work on the transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics itself, but the projected work remained fragmentary and disorganized. The notes Kant produced during this period showed the deterioration of his ability to maintain sustained argument and systematic organization, though passages of clarity and insight still appeared intermittently. Friends and former students visited regularly, providing companionship and assistance with daily needs. Kant required help with dressing, eating, and other routine activities that had once been managed independently. The household staff attended to practical matters, and servants ensured that meals were prepared and that the house remained in order. The professor's younger years had been characterized by independence and self-sufficiency, but the final years required increasing dependence on others. The daily walk that had been so regular for decades became shorter and less frequent. Kant could no longer manage the long walks through the city, and he confined himself to brief movements within his house and garden. The physical weakness that accompanied aging made even short walks difficult, and eventually Kant rarely left his residence. The connection to the city that the daily walk had maintained diminished as mobility declined. Despite the physical and mental decline, Kant maintained certain habits and preferences. He insisted on proper table settings and maintained interest in conversation during meals, even when his contributions became less coherent. He asked about news and events in Königsberg and beyond, showing continued interest in the world despite his inability to engage with it actively. The routines of rising, eating, and retiring maintained some regularity even as the content of each day became less productive and more confined. The turn of the century in 1800 marked Kant's 76th year. The intellectual work that had occupied so much of his life had largely ceased, though unpublished manuscripts remained in various states of completion. The Critical philosophy that had established his reputation was complete in its essential elements, and the works published during the 1780s and 1790s had secured his place in the history of philosophy. What remained were the years of decline that came with age and failing health. Former students published books developing and defending Kant's philosophy, and debates about the interpretation and implications of the critical philosophy continued in German universities. Kant himself no longer participated actively in these discussions, though he remained aware that his work had generated significant influence. Letters arrived from admirers and from scholars seeking clarification of specific points, though Kant's ability to respond coherently had diminished. In 1801, a biography of Kant appeared, written by a former student who had observed the philosopher during his later years. The biography presented an account of Kant's life, his daily habits, and his philosophical development, providing information that helped contemporaries understand the man behind the difficult philosophical works. Kant himself had shared details of his life and routine with the biographer, though his memory of specific dates and events had become unreliable. The household in which Kant spent his final years maintained a quiet atmosphere. Servants attended to necessary tasks, and visitors came at regular times to check on the professor's condition. The rooms contained books that Kant had collected over decades, philosophical works and scientific treatises that had informed his thinking and that now stood as silent witnesses to intellectual labors that had ended. The study where so much writing had been done remained furnished with desk, chair, and bookshelves, though the activity that had once filled those spaces had ceased. The decline continued through 1802 and 1803. Kant's ability to communicate diminished, and he spoke less frequently and less coherently. His recognition of visitors became uncertain, and he sometimes failed to identify people he had known for years. The physical weakness increased, and Kant spent more time in bed or seated rather than moving about. The vital energy that had sustained decades of teaching, writing, and social activity had dissipated, leaving a frail figure who required constant care. In early 1804, Kant's condition worsened further. He ate little, spoke rarely, and showed minimal awareness of his surroundings. The servants and the physician who attended him recognized that death approached, though the exact timing remained uncertain. The process of dying extended over several weeks, with gradual weakening of bodily functions and progressive withdrawal from conscious engagement with the world. On February 12, 1804, Immanuel Kant died in his house in Königsberg. He was 79 years old and had lived his entire life within the city where he was born. The death occurred quietly, with no dramatic final words or gestures recorded. The philosopher who had examined the foundations of human knowledge, analyzed the basis of moral obligation, and investigated the nature of aesthetic judgment passed from life as an elderly man whose vital powers had gradually diminished until they ceased. The funeral took place on February 28, 1804, with ceremonies befitting a distinguished professor and respected citizen. The university honored Kant with formal observances, and a large number of people attended the services. The burial took place at the cathedral in Königsberg, and Kant's remains were interred in the professor's vault. The funeral provided occasion for public recognition of Kant's achievements and for expressions of respect from colleagues, former students, and citizens who had known him. The immediate aftermath of Kant's death saw the publication of obituaries and memorial notices in newspapers and journals. Writers summarized his life, listed his publications, and assessed his contributions to philosophy. Some notices emphasized his role in reforming metaphysics and establishing criticism as the proper method of philosophy. Others noted his moral philosophy and his influence on ethical theory. The assessments varied in their judgments about the lasting significance of Kant's work, with some predicting that his philosophy would dominate future thought, while others suggested that elements of his system would require revision or rejection. The manuscripts that Kant left unpublished presented questions about what should be done with them. Some materials consisted of rough notes and fragmentary thoughts that had never been organized for publication. Other manuscripts represented work on the projected transition from metaphysical foundations to physics, a project that Kant had been unable to complete. Editors examined these materials and eventually published some of them, though questions about their status and authority remained contested. The students who had studied with Kant and the scholars who had engaged with his work began to develop systematic interpretations of the critical philosophy. Different schools of thought emerged, with some emphasizing the epistemological elements of Kant's work, while others focused on the practical philosophy and ethics. Debates arose about whether Kant had adequately answered Hume's skepticism, whether the thing in itself was a coherent concept, and whether the categorical imperative could generate substantive moral guidance. The influence of Kant's philosophy spread beyond Germany through translations of his works and through the writings of philosophers who engaged with his ideas. French and English translations appeared, though the difficulty of Kant's prose made translation challenging and interpretation uncertain. Philosophers in different countries developed their own readings of Kant, sometimes emphasizing different aspects of his thought or combining Kantian elements with other philosophical traditions. The critical philosophy's impact on subsequent thought proved substantial and lasting. Kant's questions about the conditions of possible experience, the nature of synthetic a priori knowledge, and the relationship between freedom and natural law shaped philosophical inquiry for generations. His analysis of the limitations of theoretical reason influenced discussions of metaphysics and theology. His moral philosophy provided foundations for thinking about autonomy, dignity, and moral obligation. His political thought contributed to liberalism and to theories of international law and perpetual peace. The systematic character of Kant's philosophy, with its distinctions between phenomena and noumena, its categories of understanding, and its complex arguments about the scope and limits of reason, provided material for extensive commentary and interpretation. Philosophical scholarship developed around explicating Kant's arguments, examining their presuppositions, and evaluating their success or failure. The secondary literature on Kant grew substantially as successive generations of philosophers engaged with his work. The biographical details of Kant's life, his regular habits, and his personal characteristics became part of the reception of his philosophy. Stories about his punctual daily walk, his systematic routine, and his careful attention to health and diet circulated alongside discussions of the critiques and other philosophical works. Some writers suggested that the regularity of Kant's life reflected the systematic character of his thought, while others cautioned against reading too much significance into biographical details. The political and social changes that occurred in Europe during the decades after Kant's death created new contexts for reading his philosophy. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars raised questions about political authority, national sovereignty, and the possibility of republican government. Kant's writings on politics and history offered resources for thinking about these issues, and his arguments for cosmopolitan right and perpetual peace attracted attention from those concerned with international relations. The development of German idealism by philosophers such as Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel took Kant's critical philosophy as a point of departure, while also criticizing what they viewed as its limitations. These thinkers accepted Kant's critique of traditional metaphysics, but attempted to overcome what they saw as the dualism between phenomena and things in themselves. The question of whether Kant's philosophy could be developed into a more comprehensive system became a central concern in German philosophy during the early 19th century. The scientific developments of the 19th century raised questions about the relationship between Kant's philosophy and empirical research. His claims about the necessity of Euclidean geometry and Newtonian mechanics faced challenges from non-Euclidean geometries and from new physical theories. Philosophers debated whether Kant's arguments about the synthetic a priori could survive these scientific changes, or whether the critical philosophy required modification to accommodate new scientific knowledge. The moral and political philosophy that Kant had developed continued to influence thinking about ethics and political theory. The emphasis on autonomy and rational self-legislation shaped liberal political thought, and the categorical imperative provided a framework for moral reasoning that contrasted with utilitarian approaches to ethics. Arguments about human dignity, the prohibition against treating persons merely as means, and the duty to respect rational nature informed discussions of rights and justice. The philosophy of religion that Kant had presented in his later works influenced theological discussions about the relationship between faith and reason, about the rational foundations of religious belief, and about the proper interpretation of religious doctrines. His arguments that theoretical reason cannot establish metaphysical truths about God, while practical reason provides grounds for moral faith, generated debates among theologians and philosophers about the nature of religious knowledge. The aesthetic theory presented in the Critique of Judgment influenced thinking about beauty, art, and aesthetic experience. Kant's analysis of aesthetic judgment as claiming universal validity, despite being based on subjective feeling-raised questions about the nature of taste and the possibility of aesthetic standards. His discussions of the sublime, of genius, and of the relationship between art and nature contributed to aesthetic theory and art criticism. The institutional structures of German universities preserved and transmitted Kant's philosophy through courses on the history of philosophy and through specialized studies of his major works. The three critiques became standard texts for advanced students of philosophy, and mastery of Kant's thought was considered essential for serious philosophical work. The difficulty of his prose and the complexity of his arguments meant that reading Kant required sustained effort and careful study, but the importance of his contributions ensured continued attention. The anniversaries of Kant's birth and death occasioned commemorative publications, conferences, and public lectures that assessed his legacy and examined the continued relevance of his philosophy. Scholars produced detailed studies of specific aspects of his thought, historical investigations of his philosophical development, and comparative analyses of his positions relative to other philosophers. The scholarly apparatus surrounding Kant's work grew extensive, with editions of his complete writings, bibliographies of secondary literature, and specialized journals devoted to Kantian studies. The political contexts in which Kant's work was read shifted over time, with different generations finding different aspects of his philosophy relevant to their concerns. Liberal thinkers emphasized his arguments for individual autonomy and rational self-determination. Socialist thinkers found resources in his critique of treating persons as mere means. Nationalist thinkers sometimes claimed Kant as a German philosopher whose work expressed distinctive German contributions to world culture, while others stressed the cosmopolitan and universal aspects of his thought. The translation of Kant's works into multiple languages extended his influence globally, though translation problems and differing philosophical traditions meant that reception varied across linguistic and cultural contexts. English-language philosophy developed its own distinctive engagement with Kant, often focusing on epistemological questions about knowledge and skepticism. French philosophy emphasized different aspects of Kant's work, sometimes connecting his thought to phenomenological and existential traditions. The global spread of Kant's influence demonstrated the significance of his contributions, while also showing how philosophical ideas adapt to different intellectual environments. The methodological approaches to studying Kant's philosophy evolved over time, with historical research examining the sources of his ideas and the development of his thought across different periods. Scholars investigated Kant's reading, his correspondence, his lecture notes, and other materials to understand the formation of his philosophical positions. This historical work provided context for interpreting the published works and revealed complexities in Kant's intellectual development that were not immediately apparent from the critical philosophy's systematic presentation. The question of which elements of Kant's philosophy remain valid and which require revision or rejection continued to occupy philosophers in subsequent generations. Some argued that the critical philosophy successfully established permanent insights about the limits of theoretical reason and the foundations of morality. Others contended that specific Kantian doctrines, such as the synthetic a priori or the thing in itself, involved confusions or errors that needed correction. The ongoing philosophical engagement with Kant's work showed both the enduring significance of the questions he raised and the controversies surrounding his answers. The influence of Kant's thought extended beyond professional philosophy to affect how educated people thought about knowledge, morality, and human nature. The idea that our cognitive faculties actively structure experience rather than passively receiving information from external reality became a widely shared understanding. The conception of moral obligation as based on rational autonomy rather than divine command or natural inclination shaped modern ethical consciousness. The distinction between what can be known through theoretical reason and what can only be affirmed through practical faith influenced how people thought about the relationship between science and religion. The physical location where Kant lived and worked became a site of philosophical and historical interest. Königsberg itself underwent significant changes in subsequent centuries, experiencing political transformations and ultimately becoming part of Russia as Kaliningrad after World War II. The cathedral where Kant was buried remained, and his tomb became a memorial visited by those interested in his life and work. The house where he lived no longer stood in its original form, but the places he had known and the routes he had walked became part of the historical memory associated with his philosophy. The institutional legacy of Kant's work included the establishment of philosophical methods and standards that emphasized rigorous argument, systematic analysis, and critical examination of presuppositions. The practice of philosophy in universities came to involve careful study of major philosophical texts, detailed commentary on arguments, and examination of the logical structure of philosophical positions. Kant's example of sustained systematic work on fundamental problems provided a model for how philosophy could be pursued as a serious academic discipline. The continuing study of Kant's philosophy in the 21st century demonstrated the lasting significance of the questions he raised and the systematic rigor with which he addressed them. Scholars continued to produce new interpretations of his works, to debate the validity of his arguments, and to apply his insights to contemporary philosophical problems. The critical philosophy remained a central reference point for discussions of epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and political philosophy, ensuring that Kant's influence persisted more than 2 centuries after his death. The philosophical contributions that emerged from a life spent almost entirely within a single city, organized around regular routines of teaching and study, achieved influence extending far beyond the geographical and temporal boundaries of that life. The works, composed in quiet study, developed through years of patient analysis, and refined through repeated revision, established positions and raised questions that continued to shape philosophical inquiry long after the author had died. The systematic examination of human knowledge and moral obligation that Kant undertook provided resources for thinking about fundamental problems that remained relevant across changing historical circumstances and different cultural contexts.